بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تمسك بسنته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Beloved brothers and sisters, alhamdulillah, we are continuing on with our marriage course. And today we are looking at the second part of cultural clash. The second part of cultural clash, inshallah ta'ala. I'm just sharing to two more locations. And today we will be taking his side of the story, with a small analysis that they give us in the book, and then we'll move forward towards the analysis that I have put together from what I've seen, or from what I felt after reading some of his side of the story, inshallah ta'ala. So to commence, inshallah ta'ala, we are, bismillah. So it begins by his side of the story saying, marriage is always more than a union, more than just a union of a man and a woman. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the reflection. So he begins, I was mistaken in my marriage to her. I misjudged her character and her integrity. I had watched her many times. If you remember, brothers and sisters, this was an American woman marrying an Egyptian man or a Palestinian man. And he met her at a diner or a restaurant where she was a waitress at, and he approached her and began giving her da'wah and then married her. So he began saying, I was mistaken in my marriage to her. I misjudged her character and her integrity. I had watched her many times at the restaurant and always felt great sadness in thinking that such a beautiful girl was not Muslim. So I made up my mind that she would come to know Islam and would become a Muslim, and then I would marry her. When I first saw her, I knew that Islam could save her from the deep sorrow that seemed to follow her around like a shadow. I knew that if I just could have a chance to speak with her, I could bring her into the light, so to speak. My work at the Dawah table or at the Dawah center, inviting people to Islam, helped form my passion for change and my ability to persuade people to the truth. After giving her a copy of the Quran, I prayed for her, and soon enough, my dua supplication was answered, and the pretty woman came to me at the Dawah booth on the corner of 5th and Main Street. After the September 11th attacks, I knew that I had a job to do, and that was to make sure people understood Islam the right way. It wasn't enough for me to talk about Islam at work and to try to just convince people of true Islam. I knew that I could do more and that I should do more for the religion I loved. It was this new zealous attitude that I focused on conversion. If the missionaries could do it, then why couldn't I? The once scantily clad waitress converted, and I married her because I felt responsible for her life now that she had followed the path I presented to her. I felt like she was my pet project. and I couldn't wait to see her flourish and grow under my nurturing care. She didn't grow the way I wanted her to. Even though she was a tolerably good Muslimah, I knew that she could do better, more. Yet she started acting like she already knew everything because of a few books she read and a few sheikhs she had spoken to. The longer we were married, the more she questioned me and my knowledge of Islam. She was an easy wife at first, listening to me and taking my advice to heart. Then she met my parents. My poor mother tried to be nice to her, but all she received in return was rudeness. When my mother would lean in close to inspect my new bride with love and attention, my American wife would pull herself away and stand stiffly rather than opening her arms warmly to hug the mother she should treat as her own. Considering her own parents had cut all ties with her and declared her to be unfit to be their daughter, I expected her to come running to my parents. She didn't. I encouraged her to call them and stop by and to visit them without me, but she stayed away and could barely carry a civil conversation with them. My parents could feel her negativity and were sorely disappointed in my choice of a bride. They would have liked to have chosen for me an Arab wife who would have known her place, one who would care for them in their old age rather than trying to keep away from them. As disappointed as I was in her behavior, I tried to convince my family that my wife would come around in time. She was still young and a new convert at that, but I was sure that I could change her for the better. My family thought she was not good enough for me. It took me quite a few years to admit they were right. Coming from a large family, I knew that making sure she could bear children was a priority for me. She was also pinning for something to do, so we got started right away, meaning having children. A few weeks into our marriage, she found out that she was pregnant. I was happy that she was with child, but I did not need to know all of the details of her pregnancy. She seemed determined to share with me every time she threw up or felt constipated. She insisted on giving me a clear description and a play-by-play of what she was feeling when it clearly did not relate to me nor involve me directly. She was the mother of this child. What need did I have to know about her apparently aching back or the sciatica nerve that bothered her in her upper right thigh? She kept trying to force me to read baby books about the child's development in the womb. There are certain things that a woman should maintain privately, and what goes on inside of her body during pregnancy definitely falls under this category. I had no idea how she expected me to look at her with desire again after she described her gynecologist visit in excruciating detail. I tried to explain to her the appropriateness of a wife's behavior with her husband, but she seemed oblivious to my hints and remarks. When she was ready to deliver, she succeeded again in disgusting me by thoroughly showing me how her water had broken and practically begged me to enter the delivery room with her. I couldn't believe that she wanted me to see her in that state. If it was up to her, she would soon have me wearing an apron and standing in the kitchen cooking and folding laundry as well. Did she really not know that certain acts were delegated to women for a reason? Childbirth was definitely not something a husband ever needed to witness. Allahu Akbar. The child who turned out to be a rather cute little girl was, of course, to be named after my mother, Zuleikha. My wife rudely suggested that this was an ugly name and that she wanted to name the baby Asma or Amina. She went so far as to express her dislike of the name in front of my parents. Although I put my foot down on the name, I conceded that she could nickname the child whatever she wanted to, at home, as long as she was known to everyone else by her real name. I probably should have not even given her this concession, because after this point, she acted like she could walk all over me and thoroughly took advantage of my concern for her. Once she returned home with the baby, her crass demeanor continued. She would sit and nurse in front of me, fully exposed, with no shame whatsoever. She complained about engorgement, soreness, and the stretch marks all over her body without any regard for my disgust at these incredibly private details. She even expected me to change diapers and provide bottles for the child at night. Didn't she know that I had a full-time job that kept this family clothed and fed? I wasn't her wet nurse or her nanny. It was her job to clean the house, to cook the meals, to do the laundry, and to care for the child, while I earned the money that helped to keep a roof over our heads. Somehow, she thought that just having the baby earned her the right to kick back and do nothing while their entire household fell apart. I tried to make excuses for her since I could understand that her current lack of family was probably difficult. Yet, try as they might, she would not even let my family get close to her and the child. When they wanted to stop by, she would always say she was too tired and would inhospitably turn them away. Soon, my entire family swore off entering our house because of my rude wife. I tried to spare her the details of my parents' disapprovals as I held on to the rope that she would really one day change. Soon after our first child, she became pregnant again. Once again, she acted like the world owed her something for accomplishing what she thought was an incredible feat. I couldn't believe how spoiled and self-centered this woman really was. Back in the villages of Palestine, my aunts and cousins would each have 5, 6, 7 children and still cook and clean and work in the fields with their husbands and prepare a hot meal. And a hot meal was always prepared and ready for the husband's return home for dinner. My wife, on the other hand, felt that being pregnant entitled her to sit back and watch Oprah all day, eating bonbons and chocolate ice cream straight from the tub. It was utterly disgusting and ridiculous. Our second child was a healthy son. We named him Abdul Basit, after my father, of course. Again, we had many disputes about the name, but this time I would not budge. Returning home with this child, my wife became nearly impossible to bear. There was constant whining about the little thick sleep she got and the difficulty of juggling 2 children and what she called my lack of involvement. I tried to call my wife's attention to our many friends in the community and how most juggled a great deal more responsibility than merely raising 2 children like her. I was beginning to realize that my wife did not have the stamina or the basic instincts of motherhood that my friends' Arab wives had. This is when the first realizations of my error in judgment began to bother me regarding our marriage. She could neither cook nor keep the house like my friends' wives, and all I ever heard from her were the whiny complaints about the difficulty of her life. However, I knew that I had to have patience with this woman for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I tried my best to ignore her insensitive remarks and bad attitude. Soon after our second child was born, my wife was again expecting. We had many arguments about birth control, which I knew was akin to infanticide or abortion. I did not care for some of those more lenient fatwas, religious rulings that told women it is okay to block the natural path of procreation and progeny. I knew my religion well enough to interpret that the true way to sustaining the religion was through ensuring generations of young Muslims who will carry on the message long after we are gone. I don't know how she did it, but in her sneaky way, she asked the doctors to remove her child-producing organs after giving birth to our second son and pleaded that it was a medical necessity. I lost all respect for her at that point. What good was a wife who could no longer bear me children? I decided not to pursue the matter right away as she recovered from the birth of our child. After all, our deen does state that a husband must show rahmah to his wife when she is ill. Either way, I decided that when the time was right, surely a second wife would continue to provide me with the large offspring that was my right and religious duty to bring into this world. As our children grew older, my wife grew more and more disobedient. She refused to wear niqab, the full face covering from head to toe, even though I could see men giving her blue eyes and wisps of blonde hair peeking from her loosely wrapped scarf, appreciating glances even as we walked the streets together. Again, I did not push the matter since I decided she would be the one to deal with the reckoning on the day of judgment. When it came to our firstborn daughter, though I was ultimately responsible and needed to ensure she stayed on the right path. Yet even in this, my wife fought against me. She encouraged our children to engage in play dates and outings with non-Muslim classmates. She refused to speak to them in the Arabic language, the language of the Quran. And though I had paid dearly for personal tutors and a multitude of courses for her and the children, it was as if she simply wanted to defy me at every single turn. Our arguments increased on a daily basis, and I decided it was time to move our family out of this toxic environment with or without her. Again, she resisted adamantly and began to shower me with unbelievable threats about how she would fight against me and return to her family who had abandoned her years before. for the sake of our children, because he was talking about taking her out of the country. After nearly 10 years of marriage, my wife's true detestable colors were shining through. Our marriage was nothing but an empty shell, and instead of prolonging the farce, I decided to end the charade. My parents had been encouraging me to take a second wife for some time, but from a financial perspective, it did not seem like the soundest investment. So by invoking the right of talaq, of divorce, I released myself and her from any obligations towards one another. Again, I must follow the deen as prescribed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and choosing the path that is least painful for everyone involved. I am confident that I will also be able to take her from the rights of raising our children and delegate that to my mother instead, who will know how to raise them properly. I do not fight for custody to hurt her, but only to find what is in the best interest of my progeny and to release her of the burden of the responsibility. Only Allah knows what the future holds for us. Amr Mus'ad, he commented, and we're not going to look at his entire comment, we're going to take pieces of his comment regarding this story. He says, marriage is always more than just a union of a man and a woman. It is the joining of two families. It is a meeting and ideally a melding of two cultures. A man comes into a marriage from a certain background with certain expectations. The same is true for the woman. Each has formed an idea of marriage, idea of the married life, of spousal responsibilities based upon his or her upbringing. Okay. He says it is naive to think that mutual attraction is enough to sustain a marriage, even if it be more than physical attraction. Right. And here, this is extremely important, right? Because he's saying this union is not just between you and your husband or your soon-to-be husband, but this union is between you and your husband and the families that are going to be involved, right? And that, getting to know one another and getting to know your expectations as a husband, your expectations as a wife is important, right? Because you come from two different cultural places. In this case, two American and Palestinian, two different cultural places, two different cultural expectations, two different cultural ways of being raised, right, inside of the home and being brought up in that home. And then naturally, sometimes that is going to be the way you maneuver or the things you expect, right? You saw the man in the story, he wanted his wife to be like the woman from back home, cook, clean, take care of the children, go out in the fields and work, and make sure you're home on time to have my food hot, right? Subhanallah. But he married an American woman, right? Subhanallah, who accepted Islam and was a new Muslim. Allahu Akbar. How can that expectation be there, right? The same with her. She had an American mentality. She comes from American mentality of, we're in this together, right? You help me, I help you. And this is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So it is Islam. That her mentality was Islam. But because they didn't sit down and dialogue long enough to get to know what those expectations would be and whether I can live up to them, they end up 3 kids later, 10 years later, divorced. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Right? Subhanallah. He goes on to say, it would be incorrect to view the traditional gender roles as Islamic and the other not Islamic, right? Meaning that his roles, because he's Palestinian, all of that is Islamic, and that her roles are not Islamic because she comes from an American background, right? That would be a mistake, okay? He says, men are required by Allah to provide for their families. This is a requirement for men. He says, but women are not required by Allah to cook and clean for their husbands. This is a sadaqah. Cooking and cleaning and other household tasks are even negotiable in the marriage contract, right? But these are tasks that are a sadaqah, and again, these are tasks that they should talk about and share, right? Because when the marriage, another thing that I don't completely agree with is that everything becomes about the contract. Well, I'm going to place in my contract that I don't have to wash the dishes, or I'm going to place in my contract that I don't have to cook, or I'm going to place in my contract X or Y or Z. This is a marriage, right? At the end of the day, if you want to throw the crucial things out, you know what I mean, then what are you really having? Is it really a marriage that you're entering, you know what I mean, and going to have? You know, you have to come to the table as two human beings to share these tasks and these responsibilities, inshallah ta'ala, right? And help one another at the end of the day, right? It's not just about one side all of the time, inshallah ta'ala, right? And this is everything in marriage, right? And you can't be tossing around, well, this is my right and that's my right, because at the end of the day, you know, if you're living based on this is my right, that's my right, I can almost tell you and guarantee you your marriage is going to go out the door. Why? Because you're not living as husband and wife. You're living by trying to control one another by using this is my right and that is my right, right? So those things have to be careful, inshallah ta'ala. You have to go into this thing sincerely wanting to be married. I haven't seen anywhere in the relationships of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we took in the past, right, where he would tell his wives, this is my right. The wives would tell him, this is my right, Ya Rasulullah, right? Nah, right? They, mashallah, exchanged rights with one another. And they didn't throw whose rights were what at what moment and at a specific time, inshallah ta'ala, okay? And then he goes on to say, all of these expectations that are shaped by one's cultural background, these are exactly the types of issues that a man and a woman should discuss before marriage, like I mentioned, to determine if they are compatible. Apparently, none of these matters were discussed beforehand. If there were matters where religious principles were violated, they were the following: the man marrying the woman without the involvement of a guardian wali, because we didn't see that there was a wali involved, right? The forbidding the use of birth control when Allah and His Prophet did not do so, breaking the ties with parent, and the husband not encouraging her to reconnect those ties. And he says the first matter is of particular importance because a good wali, a good guardian, takes seriously his role of protecting the woman's interests, okay? To make sure that the person that she is marrying isn't a dirtbag, right? Sorry, but we're going to keep it real, right? That he isn't some dirtbag, okay? That he isn't someone who has his priorities upside down, is that he's someone that understands his religion, that he's someone that's not going to want a servant or a maid, but that he wants a spouse, inshallah ta'ala, who's going to share with him in that marriage. He says the wali would have considered the suitability of the match. A good wali would have would have not immediately recommended that the new Muslim marry, right? The good wali would have told her, take your time, sister. You just became Muslim yesterday. Why are you going to marry today? You know what I mean? Don't rush, right? But rather he would consider her cultural background and the suitor's background and make recommendations to the woman based upon his experience. In the case of this broken marriage, the man saw himself as a protector of the woman, but he did not fully embrace the role of husband, at least in the way that a woman raised in contemporary America would expect. There's too much paternalism of the man viewing his wife as his pet project, right? Subhanallah. In a healthy marriage, a husband and a wife are peers, okay? In a healthy marriage, the husband and the wife are peers, and they do not see one another, and they see one another as equals, okay? Neither spouse should look down upon the other. If a man would like his wife to wear hijab, he should not seek out women who did not wear hijab, right? He sought out a woman who came from disbelief, who didn't wear hijab, and then he expected that tomorrow she was going to wear hijab and niqab and the whole 9 yards, right? Almost impossible, okay? In hopes that he will convince his wife somewhere down the line that she'll wear it, right? At some later point in time. If a woman expects to live a luxurious lifestyle, she should not accept a man who has modest expectation and no ambition for wealth, right? So if a man is a zahid, he is someone who is an abstainer from the worldly things, then that's not the man you want to be with, inshallah ta'ala, if you want to be living lavishly, because he's probably going to be comfortable living, you know what I mean, in a small, uncomfortable apartment because that's all he needs with a few pieces of clothing, right? Subhanallah. He says, some might believe that Islam is enough of a bond between a man and a woman. He says, this is overly idealistic, okay? That Islam is not enough. You need to do your research and make sure that you check all of your boxes, inshallah ta'ala, so that inshallah ta'ala, you are not left lost, okay? And then we'll go back to some more reflections, inshallah ta'ala, but I want to open up the floor if anybody wants to share how they feel or what they think before we continue with the reflections. it would be great, inshallah ta'ala. You should be able to unmic yourself. If you need access to unmiking, again, you can raise your hand. I'm not sure why the system has been acting up, but you should be able to unmic yourself. Bismillah, let me see. And you can send questions in the chat. So someone in the chat says, how does a woman who doesn't have a wali go about marriage? So the woman who doesn't have a wali, she has to go, and inshallah ta'ala, is usually the father, the grandfather, the brother, right? The male relatives in her family, and Muslim relatives in her family. If she doesn't have those male Muslim relatives, then she will go to her local imam, and the local imam would appoint a wali for her, inshallah ta'ala. One of the biggest mistakes sometimes that happens is they go to a close friend and they're like, can you become my wali for me? And it's like, okay, I'll look you out. And really no one worries about the rights and the responsibilities and taking their duties the way they're supposed to uphold their duties. And then you end up almost in the same situation. So you go to the imam should have a system in his masjid, inshallah ta'ala. Either he becomes the wali or he appoints someone to become the wali. And then inshallah ta'ala, it goes on from there, inshallah ta'ala. Anyone else wants to unmic, share, comment, ask? Don't be nervous. So I'll give you some more time to think, inshallah ta'ala, as we finish some of the reflections. So the first, when we go back to the beginning of the story, right, that we see that he was in the restaurant. Obviously, he's been seeing and watching this woman for some time. He says, I made up my mind that she would come to know Islam and would become a Muslim, and then I would marry her, right? So here, one of the things that we see immediately, right, is the conflict in his intentions, right? The Prophet ﷺ, he told us in a hadith where he says that, your hijrah is whatever you make your hijrah for, right? If your hijrah is to Allah and His Messenger, then you will achieve Allah and His Messenger. And hijrah here means the path that you're traveling, traversing, walking upon, inshallah ta'ala, right? Your journey from one state to another, from one place to another. He says, or if your hijrah is to marry a woman, right, or some worldly benefit, then your hijrah will be what it was for, right? Meaning you'll get the wife, you get the husband, right? But not necessarily the wife and the husband that you truly wanted, right? Because intention is everything. And sometimes, as we see here, the intention here can be conflicted. Here he had the intent of, I'm going to give a da'wah, right? But the da'wah wasn't because, okay, I want to give her Islam and teach her about Islam. The da'wah was, I want to teach her about Islam because she's beautiful. And perhaps I can make her my wife. And then perhaps I can further teach her, inshallah ta'ala, and save her life, right? As he mentions, she would become my pet project. Like, subhanAllah, like, what kind of da'wah is that, right? That intention is twisted, right? If you're in the field of da'wah, inshallah ta'ala, then the purpose of da'wah is never conversion. The purpose of da'wah is to give a clear message. وَمَا عَلَيْكَ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ الْمُبِينُ كما قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن الكريم, right? As Allah says in the Quran to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he informs Muhammad, and Muhammad relays back, وَمَا عَلَيْكَ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ الْمُبِينُ, and upon you, O Muhammad, is to give a clear message, okay? And Allah yahdi man yasha wa yu'addimu man yasha, right? And Allah is the one who guides whom He wills, or leads astray whomever He wills, right? Conversion isn't our purpose, right? We don't go out saying, I'm going to convert this person. No, I go out to give a clear message so that you understand Islam clearly, and then either Allah touches your hearts and He opens up your chest to accept the message, or He keeps it constricted and closed and you never accept the message, right? So here already we saw that the intention was problematic, inshallah ta'ala, right? Because he says, I focused on conversion, right? This was my new zealous attitude that I walk out in the street, I was going to convert people like the missionaries, right? That's the first mistake. And he says, I felt like she was my pet project, and I couldn't wait to see her flourish and grow under my nurturing care. And then we find that after she got married to him, that whole entire nurturing care business of teaching her and educating her went out the door, right? Because we seen in her story that she was like, after Islam, we couldn't even sit down and talk about Islam anymore. He didn't even teach me anymore, subhanAllah. Go ahead, Sister Munira. Munira, Bismillah. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I find it interesting that his initially his approach was to give her knowledge and give her dawah, but then as she started to seek those knowledge on her own and approach imams and question his knowledge or his way of acting, then it became a threat to him. And therefore he felt like she all of a sudden felt like she was better than him, given that while she's a new, she just converted yesterday, what I grew up as a Muslim.
No. And that kind of further went to show us his intent, right? That his intent really wasn't to teach her, right? And then when she began to learn, right? And oftentimes this happens in marriage as well, that the person begins to learn who really didn't know, right? Because we have this happen all the time. This story is not a new story. This story happens all of the time. The brothers go out, they see that beautiful woman, and they give her dawah with the intention of marrying her because they need to bring home a Muslim wife because culturally their family is not going to have it or be happy if they don't, right? And then when the woman begins to learn her rights, when the woman begins to study, when she begins to ask the imam and the sheikhs questions, and she begins to get answers, and she begins to bring that home, right? The man is upset now. Why? Because the woman is learning what is correct and what is incorrect, and is going against what his desires want him to have, right? And in this case, especially culturally, right? Because he's holding on to a cultural understanding of back home that has nothing to do with Islam. And when she presents Islam to him, he doesn't want to hear it. He's upset, right? Allahu Akbar, right? And this is why we tell brothers and sisters all the time that it is important, right? Like right now, I'll be perfectly honest. Right now, we have, I don't know who the iPhone is, but right now we have 2 brothers in the room, right? Out of 12 sisters. That's problematic. If we only have 2 brothers coming to learn about marriage, and we have 12 sisters coming to learn about marriage, we see the problem that exists in the ummah at the moment. The men, you think you got it, and you don't, right? Just like this man, he thought he had it, and he didn't. So what happens is now when you get into the household, and the woman, she knows her rights, and she knows, mashallah, her deen, right? And she can quote it, and she can go back, and she can find the resources, and you don't. And then now you expect someone to be submissive to you because you never showed up in class, you never went out to study, you didn't go out and learn. That now there's an imbalance that takes place in the household. And it's unfortunate, but this happens a lot, right? And for my brothers, really, you're supposed to be up in here as well. You know what I mean? Because the fact is that we are not raised knowing these things, and if you look at this man and his experience and him looking at his family as the marker of what a wife is supposed to be, you miss the mark Islamically. Right? Because his marker was she's going to be barefoot, pregnant, over the stove, cooking, slaving out in the field, make sure my food is hot when I get home, rub my feet, inshallah ta'ala, rub my back, I go to sleep. I don't want anything to do with the children or the house. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Where have we seen that in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Abadan, nowhere. We haven't seen it in no place whatsoever, right? But this is the reason that we are having these issues, because it is due to lack of knowledge, right? And then our brothers, they call us, Imam, I want to get married. How you want to get married, brother? You ain't been present. You ain't been around. You know what I'm saying? You don't know what to do. You don't know the love languages. You don't know how to communicate. You don't know this. You don't know that. What's going on? How am I going to get you married, right, to a sister who's been putting in the time and you just chilling, maybe watching some TV or doing something else, maybe watching the ball game? You know what I mean? That's problematic, inshallah ta'ala, right? And then we see that this comes into the marriage later on, inshallah ta'ala, just like it came into this marriage. She started learning her deen. He didn't like that at all, subhanAllah, right? And then she said, the whole issue about the mother. One of the things we need to realize is that is another very important aspect of in-laws, right? Meeting your in-laws prior to getting married is extremely important because they're going to become your family. And if you don't like them in the beginning, more than likely you're not going to like them in the middle or at the end either, right? It's very rare that if you don't get along with them in the beginning, that things are going to progress and be something else later on. Sometimes things can change, right? But there needs to be a meeting, inshallah ta'ala, and some type of interaction with that family, inshallah ta'ala, right? And then, inshallah ta'ala, you try to build and expand on that relationship later on, inshallah. Why? Because that's your wife's family. It's important for you to know to have a relationship with her father, with her mother. It's important for her to have a relationship with your father and your mother. The last thing you want to do is be in a relationship, as some relationships that I've seen, where the husband says to the wife, well, I'm going to take the kids to visit my mother and my father, but you can't come because, you guys can't get along. So every time I go to see my parents, you can't come with me. What is that? What type of, that's unhealthy, especially for the children. We're going to go see grandpa and grandma, but mama can't come along. You know what I mean? Because they don't like mommy. Or, you get over there and grandpa and grandma probably start talk bad about my mother. That's not, what I mean? That the kid, it brings harm into the household. It creates issues. And most of those marriages, I can tell you, most of those marriages have also ended in divorce, right? Why? Because a person is only going to put up with that for so long, inshallah ta'ala. So getting to meet the in-laws, getting to meet the other side, inshallah ta'ala, is important because you are marrying into that side of the family. Okay, you're going to go visit them, you're going to spend holidays over there, maybe vacations over there. Sometimes you end up living in the same home. You have to move in, and it can be years, 8 years, 10 years, 15 years. You know what I mean? Maybe they got old, they got sick, and all of a sudden they the wife or the husband says, my parents are going to come live with us, or we're going to go live with them so we can take care of them. And if you're not getting along, that is going to be a mission in your life, right? That is going to destroy your relationship because you're not going to be happy with them around. They're not going to be happy because you're around. Your wife or your husband is not going to be happy because there's conflict between you and them, and they're always caught in the middle. And eventually they're going to choose one side or the other, okay? So it's always best to do your best to get to know who you're going to marry, the family you're going to marry into, inshallah ta'ala, so that inshallah ta'ala you are making educated choices of, okay, this is a family I can deal with, inshallah. Go ahead, Sister Munira. Bismillah.
I have another question. So how valid is that marriage given that the sister didn't have a wali?
So in terms of, the marriage is still valid. If they did everything else, it's valid. It didn't invalidate the marriage itself. But, they took the wrong steps, unfortunately. She should have had a wali who helped her along those steps, inshallah ta'ala. But, you'll find, within the different schools that, the marriage is not invalidated, inshallah ta'ala. Unfortunately. And like I said, many people do this, unfortunately. And they take and they end up in a bad place. What happens is that these are like those 2-3 day marriages, those weak marriages, where they met, they go to the Imam, and it's just like, Imam, I want to get married. And the Imam is like, okay, whatever Imam they have really probably doesn't care either. He's like, okay, whatever, you want to get married, fine, no problem, right? And he comes together, he puts them together, he figures maybe he's going to stop fornication, he's going to stop whatever else is going on, and Bismillah, he finds and gets the 2 witnesses, and he has the marriage contract in front of him, and inshallah ta'ala, he marries them off, and Bismillah, goodbye. It happens all the time, unfortunately, right? It happens all the time, unfortunately. And then sometimes what happens as well is that they may come to an Imam who says, no, slow down, guys. Like, slow down, hold on. We need to take some other things into consideration, make sure you guys are taking the right steps. And then what happens is those people don't like that. So they end up going Imam shopping, right? So who's the Imam that's going to marry us, inshallah ta'ala, and not give us a hard time, okay? So basically, a lot of the calls that I get are sometimes calls like this: Imam, do we have to go to the courthouse and get married beforehand? And unfortunately, in most massages now, yes, you got to go get married legally. Why? Because that's going to show me mashallah, real you are about wanting to marry this person, right? Because you have those who say, no, no, I don't want the legal marriage. I just want the Islamic marriage, right? The legal marriage is Islamic, is acceptable. I just want the marriage with the Imam marrying us, inshallah ta'ala. And that's the marriage where she has no rights. That's the marriage where she gets no insurance. That's the marriage where she gets no bequests. That's the marriage where if she dies or you die, you have no rights to say anything over the body because you're really not married according to the state, right? Because the Imam you just did it in some masjid or in some backyard or over the phone or in your house, you know what I mean? And there was no real paperwork done, inshallah ta'ala, so the state is not recognizing it. So you have nothing, right? As a wife, you have nothing whatsoever that you're entitled to. These marriages can't continue to happen like that. You know what I mean? We've seen too many sisters get affected by these type of marriages, right? But then in certain cases, the sisters also, because they're desperate to get married, they want to waive everything else. No, it's okay. Just let us get married Islamically and forget about getting married by the law. So usually a person like myself will say, go find someone else. I don't want to be involved. You know what I mean? Unless I knew that both families were involved and, they really did some, effort to make this thing work. There may be some exceptions there may be some exceptions at times, but for the most part, the rule is, you have to go to the courthouse. You have to get the paperwork from the courthouse. You have to bring that back to me, inshallah ta'ala. I have to sign it. I drop it off at the courthouse. You guys are legally married after that, So, unfortunately, this is why these type of things happen. But, the marriage is still valid, unfortunately. And then as well, he expected her to have a relationship with her in-laws, right? Where he says, I encouraged her to call them or stop by and visit without me. But if she's not getting along with them, how can you force that upon your wife, right? And then at the same time, he was like, she should have ran to them since her family cut her off. Why didn't he encourage her Islamically? You're not supposed to cut the ties of kin, right? You're supposed to keep the ties of your family relations. That is haram for you to cut that off, right? So if you cut that off, or she cut that off, and you were a good practicing Muslim man, he should have told her, you need to call your parents and you need to make up, inshallah ta'ala, with them, okay? You need to call your parents and you need to make up with them, and you can't keep them cut off, inshallah ta'ala, right? So this becomes an issue, as well. That he didn't encourage her to have her parents in her life, inshallah ta'ala. Sister Monira said, I was also surprised by the way the brother looked at the wife's knowledge as putting him down. It seems both has defect in communication skills. Yes, absolutely agree. And then the language barrier was another thing that he did not acknowledge. And yes, those things are, subhanAllah, unfortunate as well, because again, sometimes, he said he spent a lot of money for her to learn Arabic, right? And he wanted her to teach the kids Arabic. And that's a good thing. Alhamdulillah. That's a good thing, inshallah ta'ala. But again, she's a new Muslim. There's only so much, you can force upon a person, inshallah ta'ala, or encourage, and it shouldn't be forced upon a person. It should be encouraged, inshallah ta'ala, and then they should want to do it, inshallah ta'ala. But again, the Prophet ﷺ said, and I'll get right to you, David, the Prophet ﷺ said that the woman was created from, right, the most upper part of the rib that is crooked. He says, and if you try to straighten it, you break it, right? So deal with her according to the crookedness. And this doesn't mean that she has deficiency, right? Let's take that and throw that out the door. It doesn't mean the woman is deficient. It means she's a particular way. And she comes from this rib that is bent. And whenever you try to straighten a bent rib, you're going to break it. So deal with her accordingly, inshallah ta'ala, right? Just as she's going to deal with you according to your issues, inshallah ta'ala, as well. Go ahead, David. Bismillah. Let me see if I have the mic. Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, so let's say if your spouse and their in-laws don't get along, like say there's like a bad first impression or something, or somewhere down the line, they begin to not get along anymore. What can be done to remedy the relationship? Because the last thing we want to do is somebody would want to do is break ties.
So, you
Break the
know,
ties of kin.
yeah. So in terms of, again, in terms of the in-laws, inshallah ta'ala, I'm always for or telling people, don't allow the in-laws to break up your relationships if you're already in a relationship, okay, and you're already moved into that relationship. Sometimes there are bad first impressions, right? You know, I can tell you, when I married my wife, my father-in-law didn't like me too much, right? He used to call me macaco, right? Which meant a dude from the street, right? He didn't like me too much. That was his baby girl. She was on track in college, and she, mashallah, she hadn't made any mistakes in her life. She never had a baby. She wasn't pregnant. She ain't go through none of that stuff. Alhamdulillah, right? He raised her right with good morals, good values, right? And then he saw me come. You know, I was the street dude, you know what I mean, from the hood. I showed up. I got 2 kids. You know what I mean? When I met my wife, I remember the first day I met him, you know, personally, he came to the car, and I was in the car, and I had one of my kids in the car in the backseat. They were baby at the time, like one. And he's like, you know, whose children are these? You know, and she was like, he was like, I was like, mine, that's my son, right? And he looked at me, and he turned around, and he walked away. You know, and I'm like, subhanallah, like, Allahu Akbar, like, dude, like, you know, why you walk away from me, right? So he wasn't fond of me, but I didn't let that attitude cause me to not try to build and establish a relationship with him, right? I tried to build and establish a relationship with him. I continued to, this was before Islam, I continued to date my wife, and I continued to, every time I would come around and I would see him, I would be respectful, you know what I mean? How you doing, sir? You know, talk to him, you know what I mean? Politely and respectfully. And then when it came time to asking for his daughter's hand in marriage, you know, my wife wouldn't have it any other way except that I had to go and talk to her father and get her permission, right? His permission. And I sat down and I asked him for his permission. And he gave me about a long hour to hour and a half talk about his expectations for his daughter. You know what I mean? And what he expected me as a husband to provide for his daughter. You know, he expected me to take care of her. He expected me to treat her well. You know, he gave me examples from himself. You know, he was a man who owned his own business. He owned his own house. You know, he took care of a large family. You know what I mean? He was successful in being a father and taking care of his family. He says, I expect the same from my daughter. You know, and I said, okay, you know, and I told him I accept that responsibility. And then he put his hand in my hand. We shook hands, and he gave me his permission to marry his daughter. But I had to win his, mashallah, love over time. And I believe that I won his love over time. You know what I mean? Alhamdulillah, I believe that, you know, over time, me and him became close. You know, even when we moved away, he would call me, we would talk over the phone, we would converse, you know what I mean? We would chat. You know, when we moved back to New Jersey, I would go visit him in the store. I would sit down with him for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes spend time with him, talk, chat, you know what I mean? Sometimes we went out and had lunch together, you know what I mean, by ourselves, just me and him. He would call me, I'd go pick him up, and we would go out, and he knew I loved to eat wings. He said, come over, we're gonna go eat some wings together, and we'll go out to eat some barbecue wings, right? But I worked on that relationship, right? I made it part of my goal, my mission to work on that relationship. Why? Because I knew if I can, mashallah, get him to love me, alhamdulillah, my wife would be happy, right? Alhamdulillah. So I did that, alhamdulillah. And alhamdulillah, you know, it worked out. And later on, alhamdulillah, we began to get along. And alhamdulillah, you know, we were a family, alhamdulillah. And the same thing with my wife and my family. My family absolutely adore and they love my wife. You know, alhamdulillah, there's no issues there, alhamdulillah. So I think that, you know, initially sometimes there can be a bad opinion, there can be a bad view, because, you know, sometimes people are just going on what they know, what they see. Sometimes, you know, my wife, in the case of my wife's parents, they were older. He was, my father-in-law was much older, right? You know, generations disconnected from us, you know, and it was just me trying to meet him in the middle somewhere, inshallah ta'ala, and it worked out. So I think that all of that is possible, that, you know, if you put forth from your part, inshallah ta'ala, that eventually the in-laws will give. You know what I mean? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, you know, الرفق لا يكون في شيء إلا شانه ولا إلا زانه ولا يوزع من شيء إلا شانه. That gentleness and kindness and love and mercy and compassion and empathy and all of these things aren't placed inside of something except that it causes it to become beautiful. Illa zana, right? It beautifies it, it increases it. And it's not taken out of something except that it causes it to become detestable. So if you're that way, then it becomes hard for them not to like you, not to love you, right? Not to want to be around you, unless they're just, you know, racist or culturally just against staunchly against marrying outside their culture. Sometimes that happens, and they just push it, push and push and push and push, and there's no changing them. But I haven't seen that be the case if people work at it, inshallah, and Allah knows best. Anne Marie, did you have a question or somebody unmiked themselves? I'm sorry. But in the same breath, right, the in-laws shouldn't be the be all, you know what I mean, type of decision factor. That if something happens, halfway through my relationship with my spouse and something happens with the in-laws, then now all of a sudden, because that one thing happened with the in-laws, all of a sudden now you're going to throw your marriage out the door, inshallah ta'ala, right? Because la qaddar Allah, right? Inshallah ta'ala, things happen, Allah decrees things, and these are all tests for us that we, inshallah ta'ala, look at those things, inshallah ta'ala, and then we just try to maneuver around them, inshallah ta'ala, and figure out how to work past all of those things and still, mashallah, keep everyone loving each other the best that we can. Another message came to me privately. One of the sisters wants to know, how should she approach her husband being secretive about his feelings in the marriage? Can you explain a little bit more what the secretive, being secretive about his feelings in the marriage means? I just need a little more clarity, inshallah. And while I get the clarity, we also, this man, he didn't want anything to do with the marriage, right? I mean, with the pregnancy, it was like, subhanallah, the wife is saying my back hurts, my feet hurt, or, this is happening to me, I'm throwing up, even when her water broke, he got disgusted. He's like, dude, this is what happens during pregnancy. The water busts and then the baby, that the baby's ready to come out, subhanAllah. Being part of that process is beautiful. To see your children be born is a beautiful thing. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced in my life, right? To see my children be born, subhanAllah, was the most beautiful experience that I can ever experience in my life. Allahu Akbar. To see that life coming out of the womb of that mother, right? Subhanallah, and coming out, and the doctor hits it and it cries, and they begin to suck all of the mucus out of the nose and the mouth, and you see this little bitty precious baby. Allahu Akbar. To know that Allah, that life came from something that Allah placed in you, alhamdulillah, and that between you and your wife, mashallah, you guys created that by the permission of Allah. That puts something in your heart and puts something in your chest for your children. But when it's like, that's not my business, I don't want to see her like that. Even when he said that she was breastfeeding the children and she didn't top herself, that he was disgusted. It's like, what are you talking about? SubhanAllah, she's breastfeeding your child. She's giving your child sustenance and food, mashallah, from her breast, because Allah, mashallah, has placed milk within the woman, right? That is a miracle to be able to give and feed the child for 2 years, which is recommended in Islam, right? And after 2 years, you begin the weaning process. That, subhanAllah, that's amazing. How would you get disgusted by something like that? How would you say, I never want to look at my wife again after that? I can't see her the same. And then the stretch marks and everything else that comes with the pregnancy, maybe her getting a little bit chubby afterwards and having a difficulty in losing weight. She did all of that so that you can have your children, right? He said he wanted to have a whole bunch of children. She is tearing her body apart so that you can have the children that you want. And then you say that you're disgusted by her. Allahumma musta'an, right? This is a problem, subhanAllah, right? That's the problem, inshallah ta'ala. This and then he mentioned that was kind of part of his culture too. That the husbands don't go to see the child be born, but sometimes it's not part of the culture. Sometimes it's part of the governmental system, right? Because I know, like in Saudi Arabia, when they have the babies, and maybe this is the same in Palestine, that in Saudi Arabia, my friends have told me that have had children in Saudi Arabia. He was like, I wanted to go on with my wife, and they prevented me from going in, told me I couldn't be in there with my wife to see her give birth. And he's like, and I'm outside freaking out because, my wife is in pain and I can hear her screaming and, from the labor pains, and I couldn't be there with her to make sure that everything was okay, right? So sometimes the government system, the way it's set up, doesn't allow the man to be there. And I don't think that sometimes that's cultural, right? Because if it was cultural, I guess they would give you a choice. But here is a man coming from America saying, I want to be in the room with my wife, and they say no, right? Subhanallah. So, sometimes they're raised in a particular system, and again, they think that it has to do with Islam and it has nothing to do with Islam. Just like he thought the whole issue of birth control, right? Birth control is not haram. The scholars do, though, state that both the husband and wife should be on the same accord, right? As to saying that she's going to take the birth control or not take the birth control, right? And that if one disagrees, then that naturally, you would have to go ahead and go with continuing to have kids, right? But again, this is where you discuss this stuff before you have kids, before you begin having kids, before you get married. I want to have 2 kids. I want to have 3 kids. After that, I don't want to have no more. You know what I mean? I want to have 10 kids. Are you ready for that? I don't want 10 kids. No way. If you want 10 kids and you're going to push 10 kids on me, perhaps you're going to have to get married to somebody else, inshallah ta'ala, right? So you need to talk about these things in the beginning, because he came in wanting a tribe. She didn't want the tribe. She said, alhamdulillah, that after the 3rd one, she was forced to have the hysterectomy and not to have any more kids. You know what I mean? He didn't believe her, right? And how would he believe her if he wouldn't go to the hospital? If he wouldn't have, if he would have went to the hospital with her, probably he could have talked to the doctor and dialogue with the doctor. The doctor could have explained to him, why this needs to take place, because possibly she could be at harm if she has another kid and possibly die in the likes, because this happens with women as well. But because the brother, Subhana Rabbil Azim, didn't want to be part of that process, now all of a sudden he thinks that the wife is coming home and lying to him. Allahumma musta'an, right? So again, this is something that is beautiful, that Allah created a mercy, subhanallah, for you to be able to see and experience that. And even, mashallah, with my son, I was able to do skin to skin, because my wife, she had a C-section. She wasn't able to do it. They had to close her up. So my wife was like, please go with the baby. Make sure that he does this. You do the skin to skin with him. You know what I mean? The nurse made me take off my shirt. She gave me the baby, covered us both up. You know what I mean? That was an amazing experience that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, right? Subhanallah. And those are experiences you can't get back ever, subhanallah. So again, I think, he was just completely, in error when it came to that, inshallah ta'ala. So the clarification here is, sorry, she meant he's not showing any love or any affection or emotions towards her. So if the brother's not showing any love, any affection towards her, inshallah ta'ala, she needs to communicate with him and let him know, listen, I'm not feeling loved. I don't feel like you care for me. Inshallah ta'ala, is it possible for us to go and see a therapist or whatever have you, or, get some help? If we can't talk about it and figure it out, can we go get some help and find out what's going on and what's happening, inshallah ta'ala? Because I love you, inshallah ta'ala. I care for you. I want to be with you, inshallah ta'ala. But, I can't sit here and feel empty and feel devoid as if you don't care for me and you don't love me, inshallah ta'ala, either, right? And it's important, again, for them to know each other's love languages, right? Because maybe he's not talking her love language, right? And maybe he has a love language that he expects her to understand, and that, he's communicating with the way he understands, right? And not the way that she would like to be communicated to, inshallah ta'ala. So again, it's just, trying to communicate, her trying to communicate with him, and seeing that, if they can sit down, sometimes even maybe reading that book together, go through the 5 love languages together, inshallah ta'ala. Listen to some lectures about marriage together, about love and communication, and see if that can help out. If not, then suggest to, maybe go see a therapist and see what's going on, inshallah ta'ala. Don't let it continue going on, so it doesn't get worse and perhaps, destroy the relationship at the end. It can possibly be an easy fix. It may seem like it's something difficult or out of the world in the beginning, but it can possibly be an easy fix, inshallah ta'ala. And maybe just some miscommunication is taking place, inshallah, and Allah ta'ala knows best. Yeah, Brother Omar said, yeah, someone like himself who probably drank the milk in the same manner. Yeah, definitely. He probably drank the milk from his mother's breast, and now he's disgusted by it. It doesn't make sense, inshallah ta'ala. And yes, Sumaya says some countries overseas don't allow the men inside the delivery room. And again, that can be taken as cultural, but perhaps it's just a government rule, inshallah ta'ala. And then the fact that they did not have those important conversations seems to be a major part of their marital issues, subhanallah. Yes, absolutely. I think that was, a part of their major issues. They got married within the week. Again, just at the marriage seminar we had over the past week and last weekend on Saturday with the sisters, mashallah, Sister Roa and Sister summer, and you can go out to Mass New York Roots Reconnect to re-look at or to see that recording about how to keep a marriage full. We mentioned, that don't rush into marriage. Marriage isn't something to be rushed into. Marriage is something to take your time, ask the questions. You're going to be with this person, inshallah, for the rest of your life, right? Because that's the goal. If the goal is, I'll be with this person, if it doesn't work out, I'll move on. Your intention is not in the right place, right? Your intention is not in the right place. We're not in jahiliyyah from the X to the next, right? We're not in that lifestyle no more. Alhamdulillah, we're trying to get married, inshallah ta'ala. We're trying to stay married. We're trying to have longevity in our relationships. And more so when you begin to have children, because children need a healthy home to be raised up in, and they can't be raised up in a broken household, inshallah ta'ala. I'm just looking at Facebook. Okay, lastly, inshallah, unless there's any more questions, let me see. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So lastly, basically, we see that, he tried to tell her that he wanted to take her overseas. And taking her overseas wasn't going to be a solution to the problem either. Saying, well, I'm going to take you back to Palestine. I'm going to go ahead, we're going to go back to Egypt, or we're going to go back to Africa, or we're going to go back to wherever it is that they're from. This doesn't mean that that's going to be the solution. In many instances, we find that women fall into that scenario and they go back to those countries, and then they end up in a very bad place that they don't want to be in. SubhanAllah, sometimes the husband leaves them by themselves all of the time, and they're in the home stuck by themselves. They become kind of a slave and a servant, wondering how they're going to get out of this. And I've had quite a few cases like this as well, and they're heartbreaking, subhanAllah, right? So going back home, alhamdulillah, may not be the issue, may not solve the problem, right? Because the problem isn't that you can't raise kids here in America. The problem isn't that I'm not going to be a different wife, right? And she wasn't going to be a different wife in Palestine than she was here in America, right? Because you're just looking past the person, right? Changing the environment. Yes, sometimes it helps to change human beings, right? But you're not going to change the person and their personality that is in front of you completely, inshallah ta'ala. They are who they are. And this is why, if you got to know them, right, you would have known who they were going to be, inshallah ta'ala, and you wouldn't have had to get to that step. And then it seems like, he wanted to take the kids away from her and give them to his mother to raise. Why? Because he thought she wasn't going to be a good enough Muslim. Again, he skipped the fact that she was reading. He skipped the fact that she was learning. She skipped the fact that she was, talking to mashaykh, to scholars about, how to maneuver her life. SubhanAllah, I give her a lot of credit. She came from, working in a place where they were touching her and she was accepting for them to touch her so that she could make money, to accepting Islam, having honor for herself, standing up for herself, and trying to, mashallah, earn paradise by following the right path. Alhamdulillah, you had to give her credit for that. And you had to give her time as well to develop, inshallah ta'ala. And I don't think that was going to make her a bad mother, inshallah ta'ala. And at the end of the day, the children are always best with their mothers. In many of the cases, very few cases, should the children go to the father, inshallah ta'ala. We know Islamically, once the children reach a certain age, the age of maturity, then they can choose what parent that they want to be with, inshallah ta'ala, especially in the case of the boys. But that's something different, inshallah ta'ala. If there are any other questions, inshallah ta'ala, comments, you guys can make them. If not, then we can begin coming to a close. And then private message, someone says also so that he could afford another wife from his culture. Yes, initially he had that intention, right, of maybe being able to take on a second wife from his culture so he can have more children. But he knew that he was financially strained and that he wasn't going to be able to do so, right? SubhanAllah. So because of that, he decided to terminate the marriage and get rid of her, and then possibly go ahead and get somebody from back home, inshallah ta'ala, and marry them. And this is why I tell people all the time as well. There's nothing wrong with intercultural, to marry interracially between two different cultures, right? It's a beautiful thing. It's beautiful, it's beautiful, it's beautiful, okay? But naturally, there are some cultures that are more similar to each other than others. relationships, okay, and closer in terms of, you know, upbringing and life and food and things of the nature. Sometimes when you go too drastic, and sometimes, you know, the cultures are too different, in many instances, these marriages unfortunately don't work out. They don't work out. And then what happens is, I'm just going to go back home and get one of the wives that I know are going to be the way I want them to be, like my mama. You know what I mean? And that ends up being the case, unfortunately, inshallah ta'ala. So again, just really take your time, inshallah ta'ala. Like I said, it can work, it can be beautiful. I know many, mashallah, you know, interracial relationships, alhamdulillah, Arabs and Latinas, Arabs and Americans, and they've worked, and they, mashallah, they have longevity, inshallah ta'ala, right? But I think the people in those marriages are what make the difference as well. Alhamdulillah, they're very special people. They're people who care. They're people who took their time. They're people who consider their spouse, right? They're people who don't force their spouse to live like their mother and you know, back home, or to live like back home. They understand that the dynamic is going to be different, inshallah ta'ala, and they respect each other, and those different dynamics, when they, you know, that they're living with, inshallah ta'ala. And ultimately, if you learn each other's love languages, inshallah ta'ala, and communicate with one another, then you can overcome and surpass any difficulty that you may face in your marriage, inshallah ta'ala. And I'm a staunch believer in that, you know, marriage just doesn't break down, but we allow it to break down. You know, marriage has to be fought for. Marriage is a sacrifice. You know, marriage is work, inshallah ta'ala. And if you put in the work, you put in the sacrifice, then inshallah ta'ala, you will continue to have longevity in your marriage, and Allah will continue to bless it, inshallah ta'ala. And then finally, if the best of examples, the Prophet ﷺ, you know, if he had issues in his marriages, then naturally we are going to have issues in our marriages, inshallah ta'ala. And that's why studying his life is so important. Any other comments, questions, inshallah ta'ala? You can raise your hand as we close out. I know we're already at 9:07, so I went over 7 minutes over my mark. I apologize for that. But if there are not any other questions, inshallah ta'ala, I don't see anything coming in online. I don't see anything on Facebook. Khair. Then inshallah ta'ala, we will close out. So just a friendly reminder, inshallah ta'ala, tomorrow morning we have our morning Quran reading class, inshallah ta'ala, that is daily, that we do. Tomorrow night we have our class, our book club, Women Around the Messenger, at 8 o'clock, inshallah, p.m. Mark your calendars, November 20th. November 20th, we're going to have part 2 of our marriage, how to keep marriage full. This will be part 2 of 3, inshallah ta'ala. Is going to be held in the Mass Youth Center in Brooklyn, but we will also stream it live for those who can't come in person. And then there we're going to be dealing with identifying negative patterns in relationship. How do you identify those negative patterns in relationship? How do you identify, right, those red flags? And then how do you go ahead and begin to try to work on them, inshallah ta'ala. And we will have, alhamdulillah, 2 amazing speakers with us, inshallah ta'ala. Two sisters, Sister Sabine Sheikh and Sister Bisma Anwar, inshallah. So again, and that would be from 6 to 8:30 as our first course. So mark that in your calendars, inshallah ta'ala. We'll have food and dinner for everyone who will be present. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to bless you and all of your families. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finally something. Inshallah, Octavia, we're going to start having more in Brooklyn, inshallah ta'ala. We're going to be rotating, inshallah. So we'll be bringing more stuff to Brooklyn, inshallah ta'ala. We know that it's difficult to travel from one side of New York to the other side of New York, inshallah. But may Allah bless you all. May Allah keep you firm. May Allah give you knowledge. May Allah give you wisdom. May Allah shower your relationships, alhamdulillah, with understanding, with kindness, with empathy, with love, with care. May He place in both of your hearts the desire to want to please one another, to want to be with one another forever, to want to communicate and learn from each other, inshallah ta'ala, because often we have to learn from each other. It's not just a one-way street, right? It is a two-way street, inshallah ta'ala. And if we don't recognize that it is a two-way street, then we are walking blindly down a street by ourselves, and we're not giving the other person, our partner, their rights. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from not giving our partners their rights. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And may the peace and the blessings of Allah be upon you all.